A warm welcome once again to all the honorable judges here, to the dignitaries, to the scholars, students, media persons, and all the eminent members who have come together on this platform, a global webinar, to listen to one of the great luminaries that we have today in our country, an esteemed judge of Supreme Court, a well-known orator, thinker, writer on so many subjects. Your Lordship, we are indeed extremely privileged and thankful to you for having accepted our humble invitation to come and speak on a beautiful topic of our ethics and connect law and justice with it. A few words about your Lordship. Honorable Mr. Justice V. Ramasubramanian graduated in chemistry from Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda College, Chennai, and then studied law in the Madras Law College. He enrolled as a member of the bar in 1983, practiced for about 23 years in the High Court of Madras. He was appointed as an additional judge of the Madras High Court in 2006 and a permanent judge in 2009. He was at High Court Hyderabad for the states of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh from 2016. And after the bifurcation of the states, he was retained as a judge of the High Court of Telangana. In 2019, Sir was sworn in as the Chief Justice of Himachal Pradesh High Court and appointed Judge of the Supreme Court of India in September 2019. Honorable Mr. Justice V. Ramasubramanian has authored a book in Tamil on the principles of law and justice in Kamba Ramayana. He wrote a series of articles titled Beyond Science on the unsolved mysteries of the world. And he likes to coin new words in Tamil equivalent to new words in English. His speeches on various topics, legal matters, literary, philosophical, cultural matters in various fora are extremely popular. Over to your Lordship. Thank you.
My humble pronouns to all of you present here. It is said that what begins well augurs well. I think we have begun this program very well. This was evidenced by the fact that during the dance performance, I think the picture of Goddess Saraswati along with the garland came down from the pedestal as if to shower her blessings upon all of us. Therefore, I think we have begun well. Now it is up to me to see whether it augurs well and ends well. It is a matter of sheer coincidence that I am ordained to speak to you on a subject revolving around the two great epics of our country, especially on the eve of the Guru Purnima, also known as Vyasa Purnima. Tomorrow, the July 5th, is celebrated as Guru Purnima, Vyasa Purnima, and Buddha Purnima. But for Vedavyasa, we would not have had such a huge collection of Vedic, Puranic, and epic literature. We are therefore ever indebted to Maharishi Vedavyasa, in whose memory we observe the Guru Purnima. I would therefore make this lecture a humble offering at the feet of the great Guru Vedavyasa. As Adi Shankara pointed out, Shariram Swarupam Tadava Kalatram Yasascharu chitram dhanam meru tulyam. Gurorangi padme manaschena lagnam. Tatahkim, 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 tatahkim. One may have a pretty physical body, a beautiful wife, great fame, and immeasurable wealth equivalent to Mahameru mountain. But of what use they are if one does not offer salutations at the feet of the Guru? So asks Adi Shankara. Therefore, let me begin this talk with my humble pranams, humble obeisance to the feet of the great master. The Rig Veda declares in Mandala 1, hymn 25 as follows. Yachidite vishoyata pradevam varunavratam minimasi dyavidyavi. Its meaning is, O God Varuna, as we are men, day after day, we violate whatever law is given to us, but you shall not give us as a prey to death. This is the meaning of that hymn from the Rig Veda. Thus, our first gateway to knowledge, which was through the Rig Veda, recognizes two important things, namely, one, that we are governed by laws, and number two, that we are prone to violate the laws. Vedas did not make any pretensions about our character. Rig Veda also speaks about the law relating to crime and punishment. It says, Mano vadhaya hatnave, jihilanasya riridaha, ma hrinanasya manyave. O God, do not allow us to kill the person who insults us through ignorance. Never impel us to show our wrath to a person who is ashamed of his mistake. This hymn from the Rig Veda shows that the seeds of modern jurisprudence were sown thousands of years ago in this part of the world. The religion that has flourished for several millennia in this country did neither have a name nor a founder, but was always referred to as the Sanatana Dharma, meaning the eternal laws. The word dharma is derived from the word dhru, which denotes upholding, supporting, nourishing, and sustaining. According to Sanatana Dharma, there are 14 branches of learning known as Chaturdasha Vidya. They comprise of the 4 Vedas, 6 Angas known as Shadangas, namely Siksha, Vyakarana, Chandas, Nirukta, Jyotish, and Kalpa, and 4 Upangas, namely Mimamsa, Nyaya, Puranas, and Dharmasastras. The laws that govern individuals, groups of men, communes, and the society at large are mentioned here and there in the Vedas. They are codified in a form and presented in detail in the Dharmashastras, which are called Smritis. In modern jurisprudence, we identify 5 things, namely 1, international conventions and treaties, 2, acts of parliament or legislature, 3, the rules framed by the government for the effective implementation of the provisions of such acts, 4. Orders issued by the executive under the acts, and 5. Judicial pronouncements as the source of all laws that govern us. Similarly, Manu in his Manusmriti identifies 4 sources from which various laws emanate. Manusmriti declares, Veda Akhilo Dharma Moolam Smritishile Chatadvidam Acharashchaiva Sadhunam Atmanas Tushtirevacha. It means the Vedas are the original or primary source of all dharmas. In addition, conscientious recollection of righteous persons well versed in the scriptures, the customary practices followed by noble men, and what appeals to one's good conscience also constitute the different sources of law. This is the meaning of that verse from the Manusmriti. Thus we find in Manusmriti a recognition of common law, equity, and good conscience as the sources of all laws. As I told you earlier, what is found in the Vedas are codified in the Smritis, namely Dharmashastras. What is codified in the Dharmashastras are expounded with illustrations in the Puranas. The Itihasas and Puranas are like cases that come up before courts which call for the application of the laws to facts and circumstances complicated by real life situations. Makers of law cannot comprehend and provide for all types of situations. This is why there arise many a time in real life conflicts between 2 sets of rules or laws. Itihasas and Puranas deal with such conflicts and show us how to resolve those conflicts. Therefore, in essence, we must look at Puranas and Itihasas as case studies where complicated legal issues are attempted to be resolved. While talking of laws, we must note that there are substantial laws and procedural laws. Substantive laws are those which list out the do's and don'ts and the rights and liabilities of individuals inter se amongst themselves and as between individuals and the society. Procedural laws are those that lay down the procedure to be followed while adjudicating a dispute or finding out the truth. My endeavor today is to take you through a conducted tour of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata to find out glimpses of substantive and procedural laws that lay hidden therein, and to show that traces of what we conceive today as modern jurisprudence find a place in both these epics. I say it is a conducted tour because I am sure that people who have traveled abroad in conducted tours might have realized that they will be shown very few important places in a very hurried manner for lack of time, and that is what I also intend to do in this lecture. Let me begin with the Ramayana. After Rama's banishment to the forest and Dasaratha's death, Bharata returns to Ayodhya. Kausalya suspects Bharata to have played a role in the whole episode. Aghast at the needle of suspicion being pointed towards him, Bharata lists out the sins that would visit him if he was responsible for the two boons secured by Kaikeyi. This portion of Ramayana may be taken to contain an indication of the substantive penal laws prevailing at that time. According to Bharata, the following acts of omission and commission, among many others, will attract sin. They are: 1. Imposing heavy labor upon a servant without remunerating him appropriately. Taxing 1/6 of the income of the subjects but not protecting them is sinful for the king. Divulging to others the secrets shared by someone in private and in confidence, that is breach of confidentiality. Eating delicious food alone without partaking with others, even while surrounded by one's wife, children, and servants. Number 5, nurturing the family through the sale of liquor, poison, flesh, iron, and lacquer. Number 6, infatuation, anger, addiction to wine, women, and dice. Number 7, giving alms to the undeserved. Number 8, practicing arson and cheating a friend. Number 9, not doing service to parents. Number 10, falsifying the hopes of a destitute. Number 11, discarding the lawfully wedded wife and courting the consort of the other. Number 12, polluting a drinking water body. Number 13, denying water to a thirsty man. Number 14, standing on the road, witnessing a fight between two groups without attempting to make peace with them. These are some of the sins listed by Bharata. You may observe from the list provided by Bharata that the substantive laws prevailing then covered a wide range of subjects such as taxation, protection of water bodies, maintenance of social order and harmony, labor and employment, ethics in business and family relationships, and protection of the aged and the destitute. Though they were all listed as moral injunctions inviting sin if violated, we may take it that they also constituted the penal code of that time. You may be aware of the fact that King Dasharatha was celebrated as a Satyasandha, one who always kept up his promises. In the matter of enforcement of the two boons granted to Kaikeyi, Dasharatha gets caught in a legal conundrum. In the open assembly or court hall, where his ministers, associates, and the public had assembled, Dasharatha makes a public announcement. Yavarajye niyoktasmi pritaha purusha pungavam, meaning, I shall joyfully appoint that man of excellence as the prince. After making such a public declaration, Dasharatha seeks the opinion of the people assembled there on the ground that it is possible for people who are neutral to come up with a different opinion. In other words, Dasharatha did not impose his will upon the people despite having the authority to do so. He says, Yatyapi yesha mama pritihi hitam anyad vichintyatam anya madhyastha chintahi vimardhabhya adhikodaya vichintyatam madhyastha, people who are neutral may be able to come up with different ideas is what Dasharatha says. But all present in the assembly wholeheartedly welcome the suggestion, and Dasaratha then instructs Vasishta and Vamadeva to make preparations for the coronation of Rama. He then has Rama brought before him and administers a piece of advice. Thereafter, he goes to his palace and enters the inner chambers where Kaikeyi was staying. Kaikeyi turns the whole thing upside down by encashing the two boons given to her by Dasaratha long time ago. This situation presents a conflict between two sets of rules. Was the king entitled to change at the behest of his queen in the inner chambers of the palace a decision taken by him in full public glare with the consent of those present in the assembly? To put it in simple terms, can cabinet decisions or decisions taken on the floor of the assembly be changed in the Antahpura, inner chambers, where the queen lives? Maybe this was a precursor to the modern version of a kitchen cabinet in a democracy. Valmiki addresses this question very subtly. First, Kaikeyi extracts a promise from Dasharatha to do whatever she asks. Dasharatha swears by all his merits. He says, Karishyami tava pritim sukrutenapi te shape. Sukrutenapi, by all my merits, shape, I take a vow to fulfill whatever you ask. Immediately, Kaikeyi invites all celestials. She keeps Agni, the god of fire, in the forefront, and she announces that the promise uttered by Dasaratha should be heard by sun, moon, and other Navagrahas, the sky, the earth, celestial musicians, demons, and spirits. After invoking all of them, Kaikeyi requests not for a fresh set of boons, but for the encashment of two boons given long ago by Dasharatha. Before asking for encashment of those boons, Kaikeyi reminds Dasaratha, she says, Taut dattau varau deva nikshepau mrigayam yaham. It means, I am now pursuing those boons kept with you in safe custody for future use. She uses the word nikshepau, which means safe custody. I am pursuing those two boons which I have kept with you in safe custody, she declares. After Dasaratha swoons, Kaikeyi summons Rama and tells him of the two boons that she sought to enforce. Upon Rama's arrival, Kaikeyi says something which actually unlocks the legal conundrum as to whether she could have altered the course of events with a subsequent demand. Kaikeyi tells Rama, Atisrujya dadaniti varam mama vishampatihi sa nirartham gatajale setum banditum ichchati. The meaning of the shloka is, the king has bestowed two boons upon me. Now it will be in vain to build a dam when the water has run down. This is a very subtle resolution of the legal conundrum. Valmiki alone could have thought about this. Just see, now it will be in vain to build a dam when the water has run down. To understand this principle evolved by Valmiki, let me now give you a real life example. Take a situation where you have given an undated blank check to someone long time ago. At a time when you have almost forgotten about that check, you give a fresh check for a specified sum of money to someone else. But by the time the recipient of the fresh check presents it to his bank, if the drawee of the first check had filled up the first one and presented it for payment, the bank had to naturally honor the one presented first. This is the reason why Dasaratha could not confront Kaikeyi with a fait accompli that he had already announced the coronation of Rama and that she was a bit too late. By indicating to Rama that Dasaratha cannot build the dam after the water had run down, Kaikeyi demonstrates how the legal tussle or conflict between two promisees had to be resolved. You may be aware of the fact that all countries keep ambassadors in other countries. At times, countries also send envoys to other countries. The role of an envoy is different from that of an ambassador. While an ambassador is normally stationed in a foreign country with a mandate to represent his country's interests in that other country, an envoy is mostly sent on a special mission, generally to resolve a conflict between two states. In order to protect the person and property of such ambassadors and envoys, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a convention called the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, 1961. Interestingly, its preamble acknowledges, that is, the preamble of the Vienna Convention acknowledges that people of all nations from ancient times have recognized the status of diplomatic agents. I do not know how far this statement in the preamble of the Vienna Convention is true with regard to other countries, but it is certainly true insofar as India is concerned. Article 31 of this Vienna Convention 1961 says that a diplomatic agent shall enjoy immunity from the criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state. He shall also enjoy immunity from its civil and administrative jurisdiction, except in case he carries out a professional or commercial activity in the receiving state outside his official functions. Please keep this in mind. Now let us come to Sundarakanda of Ramayana. In Sundarakanda, Hanuman goes to Lanka, traces Sita Mata, fights with the demons, gets caught by Indrajit and taken to the court of Ravana. He cannot be taken to have gone there as an envoy, as he did not have a specific mandate from Rama to go as an envoy. Therefore, Ravana orders the killing of Maruti, but Vibhishana interferes and a conversation between him and Ravana follows. One particular statement made by Vibhishana in the conversation is very interesting. He says, Rajadharma viruddham cha lokavrittescha garhitam tavacha asadyasham veera kapehe asya pramapanam. The meaning of this shloka is, killing of this monkey is against a royal virtue and universal customs condemn it. Vibhishana uses the phrase lokavrittescha, which means according to universal practice and custom. Therefore, from this particular usage, one may think that even at that time, there was an universal or international practice of not harming the envoys. Vibhishana was such a great person that he wanted this principle to be applied even to Hanuman, who was strictly not to be construed as an envoy. But something else happens subsequently. A demon by name Shardula conducts an aerial survey of the army of monkeys and reports to Ravana about its magnitude and valor. Immediately, Ravana sends an emissary envoy by name Shuka, another demon, to talk to Sugriva and impress upon Sugriva that Kishkinta was not going to benefit from this war, and that therefore the army of monkeys must be withdrawn. Since this Shuka was sent by Ravana with a royal mandate to talk to Sugriva, the army general, this Shuka was liable to be considered legally as an envoy. This demon Shuka takes the form of a bird and reaches the place where the army of monkeys was camping. The moment he started addressing Sugriva, he was attacked by the monkeys. Fearing for his life, Shuka appeals to Rama. Na dhutan nanti kakustaha varyantam sadhuvaranaha. O Rama, envoys are not to be killed. Let your monkeys be restrained properly. After saying so, Shuka also says something which is quite interesting. Shuka says, Yastu hitva matam bhartuhu swamatam samprabhashate anuktavadi dutaha sannasa duto vadamarhati. The meaning of the shloka is, only that messenger who abandons the message of his king and gives out his own message, or a messenger who speaks that which he was not ordained to speak, is fit to be killed. Look at this statement. After proclaiming that envoys are not to be killed in general terms, Shuka, the envoy sent by Ravana, carves out an exception. That exception is that an envoy who does not convey the message of his king but chooses to convey his own message, or an envoy who conveys something which he was not authorized to convey, is fit to be killed. This particular exception is what is provided in the proviso to Article 31 of the Vienna Convention of 1961. And it is amazing that sage Valmiki had incorporated such an exception to the general rule thousands of years ago. Having seen a little of Ramayana, let us now turn to the Mahabharata. Though Mahabharata also codifies a lot of substantive laws, I shall focus on the principles of procedural law traceable to the Mahabharata. There are provisions in the codes of civil and criminal procedure for summoning witnesses and for the production of documents. There are also provisions in the Indian Evidence Act entitling a judge and the jury to put questions to witnesses in order to find out the truth. Though there are some limitations on such powers, it is required by law generally that the witnesses summoned speak the truth as they are bound by the oath administered to them. Traces of such principles of the law of evidence are found in the Mahabharata. In Adi Parva of the Mahabharata, an episode in the life of one of the Saptarishis by name Bhrigu is found. The story goes as follows. Bhrigu's wife, a pregnant woman by name Puloma, is abducted by a Rakshasa. The grievance of the Rakshasa was that this lady was earlier betrothed by her to him, but later given in marriage to Bhrigu. While carrying her away, the Rakshasa asks Agni, the fire god, as to whose wife she actually is. The Rakshasa wanted to establish that since the lady was betrothed to him earlier, she must be considered as lawfully wedded to him first. That was his intention. But Agni, after a lot of hesitation, reveals that this lady was given with holy rites and invocations only to sage Bhrigu. But upon coming to know of this conversation between the Rakshasa and Agni, sage Bhrigu gets upset and he curses Agni that he shall thenceforth eat anything, clean or unclean, offered to him. The god of fire, enraged at the curse of Bhrigu, addresses sage Bhrigu as follows, I quote, "What is this rashness you have displayed towards me, O Rishi? What transgression can be imputed to me for laboring to do justice and speaking the truth impartially? Being asked, I gave the true answer. A witness who, when interrogated about a fact of which he has knowledge, represent otherwise than it is, ruins his ancestors and descendants, both to the 7th generation. He too, who, being fully cognizant of all the particulars of an affair, does not disclose what he knows when asked, is undoubtedly stained with guilt." I unquote. Look at his statement. He says, a witness, when interrogated about a fact, is supposed to speak whatever is within his knowledge. Thus, the obligation of a witness to speak the truth, which forms the very foundation of the law of existence, is explicit in the conversation between Bhrigu and Agni that finds a place in the Adi Parva of the Mahabharata. After Sanjaya's mission to convince Yudhishthira not to wage war fails, Dhritarashtra gets mentally disturbed and seeks Vidura to give counsel to him. Vidura then speaks about Rajaniti. While speaking about Rajaniti, Vidura emphasizes the need for an effective penal code in a society. This is what Vidura says, I quote, "In malice lieth the strength of the wicked. In criminal code lieth the strength of the kings, and in forgiveness lieth the strength of the virtuous." Unquote. After highlighting the need for an effective penal code by saying that the strength of the kings lies in the criminal code, Vidura lays down three principles. He says, I quote, "Great prosperity attends upon that king who knows how to inspire confidence in others, who inflicts punishment on those whose guilt has been proved, who is acquainted with the proper measure of punishment, and who knows when mercy is to be shown." I unquote. Three things are emphasized by Vidura in this statement. The first being the award of punishment only when the guilt is proved. The second being proportionality of punishment. And the third being remission through mercy. In other words, the penal law, according to Vidura, should be both retributive and reformative. Vidura also expounds one interesting principle of the law of evidence, which we don't find in the modern jurisprudence. Vidura enlists 7 persons as incompetent witnesses. We do not have such a list in our Evidence Act, but Vidura says, a palmist, a thief turned into a merchant, a fowler, someone who hunts wild birds for food, a physician, an enemy, a friend, and a minstrel, that is a musical entertainer. These 7 are incompetent as witnesses. A palmist, a thief turned into a merchant, a fowler, a physician, an enemy, a friend, and a minstrel, according to Vidura, are incompetent as witnesses. Similarly, in the Shanti Parva, Arjuna speaks of the need for an effective penal code. He says, I quote, "A person naturally pure and righteous is scarce." Look at this statement. Arjuna says in Dwapara Yuga, we are in the Kali Yuga. In the Dwapara Yuga, Arjuna says, a person naturally pure and righteous is scarce. Yielding to the fear of chastisement, man becomes disposed to observe rules and restraints. If chastisement did not uphold and protect, then ravage and confusion would have set in on every side, and all barriers would have been swept away, and the idea of property would have disappeared. According to Arjuna, the very idea of property would have disappeared if there was no chastisement. He proceeds further to say, for keeping men awake to their duties and for the protection of property, ordinances or punitive legislation have been established in the world under the name of chastisement. Arjuna further says, one class of sinful men desist from sin through the fear of the rod of chastisement in the king's hands. Another class desist from similar acts through fear of Yama's rod. Yet another desist from fear of the next world. Another class of persons desist from sinful acts through fear of society. Therefore, O king, in this world whose course is such, everything is dependent on the rod of chastisement. This is what Arjuna declares. Legally qualified persons who have assembled here may know that sections 96 to 106 of the Indian Penal Code lay down the law relating to the right of private defense of person and property. Arjuna makes a reference to this right when he says, I quote, "There is no act that is wholly meritorious, nor any that is wholly wicked. Right or wrong, in all acts, something of both is seen. He that takes up a weapon and slays an armed foe, advancing against him, does not incur the sin of killing a foe, for it is the wrath of the advancing foe that provokes the wrath of the slayer." Just see, this summarizes in essence the right of private defense. In an indication that anyone and everyone cannot wield the power of punishment or pardon, and that it is only the king ordained to do both, Vyasa narrates a story to Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata. The story goes as follows. Vyasa says that once upon a time there were two brothers by name Shankha and Likita. Both of them are of rigid vows. The two brothers had separate dwellings located on the banks of the river Vahuda. Those residences were adorned with fruit-bearing trees. One day, Likita goes to the residence of his brother Shankha when he was not there. As he was hungry, Likita plucked and ate some ripe fruits. When Shankha came to know about this, he pulled up his brother on the ground that this act actually constituted theft. He then asks Likita to go to the king and confess to the crime. Accordingly, Likita went to the court of King Sudyumna. Since Likita was a saintly person, the king received him with due reverence. Likita then narrates the whole episode and requests the king to impose appropriate punishment for the offense committed by him. But King Sudyumna says, if the king is competent to wield the rod of chastisement, he should be regarded as equally competent to pardon. Therefore, you may consider yourself as pardoned. So says Sudyumna. But sage Likita refuses to accept any favor and insists upon being brought to judgment, as the person against whom the offense was committed did not choose to overlook the crime. Therefore, without any alternative, the king Sudyumna causes the two hands of Likita to be cut off as a punishment for the offense of theft. Likita then returns to his brother Shankha and seeks his pardon on the ground that he had received appropriate punishment. Shankha replies, I am not angry with you, brother, nor have you injured me. But by eating a fruit from a tree planted in my garden without my permission, your virtue has suffered a shock. I have rescued you from that plight. Proceed without delay to the river Vahuda and gratify duly with oblations of water the gods, rishis and pitrus. Hearing these words, Likita goes to the holy river and performs his ablutions. Upon this, two hands resembling two lotuses appear at the extremities of his stumps. Filled with wonder, he comes back to his brother and shows him the two hands. Sanka says, "All this has been accomplished by me through my penance. Do not be surprised. Providence has been the instrument here," he says. When Likita asks him why he did not purify him at first, Sanka says, "I am not thy chastiser, the ruler is." 4 principles of criminal law are deducible from the story narrated by Vyasa to Yudhishthira. They are, number 1, that taking something without permission from someone else's house, even if it be his own brother, tantamount to theft. Number 2, that the offense of theft, being an offense against the property of a citizen, can be punished only by the state. Number 3, that the state, authorized by law to punish, is also authorized by law to pardon. And number 4, that the victim is also entitled to forgive the offender after the law has taken its course. This is one example of the perfection that the system of administration of criminal justice had attained in ancient India. Lastly, I would come to one portion in the Mahabharata where many nuances and subtleties of law and justice are discussed. It is found in the Sabha Parva, which is the second book of the Mahabharata. It contains the narration of the game of dice played by Yudhishthira, in which he not only loses his kingdom, but also loses his brothers, himself, and Draupadi. When Duryodhana asks his servant Pratikamin to bring Draupadi to the assembly, Draupadi asks him whether Yudhishthira lost himself first or lost her before losing himself. If Yudhishthira had lost himself first, as it actually happened, he was stripped of the ownership of all things, tangible and intangible, and hence he could not have had any right to keep Draupadi as a bet. But without answering her question, Duryodhana makes Dushasana forcibly drag Draupadi to the assembly. In the assembly, Draupadi pleads with the elders to answer her question. Bhishma, the eldest of those assembled there, gives a very wishy-washy reply that morality is very subtle and that he is unable to decide this point. In a lighter vein, we may compare this attitude of Bhishma, expressing inability to decide this subtle point, to the modern day recusal of a judge from a case on the ground of ignorance. But Vikarna, the son of Dhritarashtra, says something very profound for those involved in the task of judging. This is what Vikarna says, I quote, "Ye kings, answer ye the question that hath been asked by Yajnaseni. If we do not judge a matter referred to us, all of us will assuredly have to go to hell without delay. Let also those kings assembled here from all directions answer according to their judgment this question, leaving aside all motives of gain and anger." This is what Vikarna says. 2 principles of law are highlighted by Vikarna in this statement, namely, 1, a person entrusted with the task of judging cannot shirk his responsibility, and number 2, that the task of judging should be carried out without any bias for or against. Unfortunately, Vikarna's repeated appeals were in vain, and at last the prince said, "Ye kings of the earth, ye Kauravas, whether you answer this question or not, I will say what I regard as just and proper. You foremost of men, it had been said that hunting, drinking, gambling, and too much enjoyment of women are the four vices of kings. The man that is addicted to these liveth forsaking virtue, and people do not regard the acts done by a person who is thus improperly engaged as of any authority. This son of Pandu, namely Yudhishthira, while deeply engaged in one of these vicious acts, urged thereto by deceitful gamblers, made Draupadi a stake. The innocent Draupadi is, besides, the common wife of all the sons of Pandu, and the king, having first lost himself, offered her as a stake. Shakuni, desirous of a stake, indeed prevailed upon the king to stake Draupadi. Reflecting upon all these circumstances, I, Vikarna, regard Draupadi as not one. This is what Vikarna declares. What is interesting about this proclamation made by Vikarna is that he brings in the law of contracts to say that a person addicted to gambling, drinking, hunting, and womanizing is not competent to contract when he is involved in any of these acts. In other words, what Vikarna speaks about is free and voluntary consent forming the basis of a contract enforceable by law. After this statement of Vikarna, Vidura speaks about the obligation of persons entrusted with the duty of judging. Vidura says, I quote, "You that are in this assembly, Draupadi, having put her question, is weeping helplessly. You are not answering her. Virtue and morality are being persecuted by such conduct. An afflicted person approacheth an assembly of good men like one that is being consumed by fire. They that are in the assembly quench that fire and cool him by means of truth and morality. The afflicted person asks the assembly about his rights as sanctioned by morality. They that are in the assembly should, unmoved by interest and anger, answer the question. You kings, Vikarna hath answered the question according to his own judgment and knowledge. You should also answer the question as you think proper. Knowing the rules of morality and having attended an assembly, he that doth not answer a query that is put to him incur half the demerit that attaches to a lie. He, on the other hand, who, knowing the rules of morality and having joined an assembly, answereth falsely, assuredly incurreth the sin of a lie." To drive home this point, Vidura then narrates a story. Once upon a time, Virochana, the son of Prahalada, quarreled with a person by name Sudanvan, son of Angirasa, for the sake of securing a bride. Both claimed that each is superior to the other and hence entitled to take the girl in marriage. Both of them go to Prahalada to arbitrate the dispute. This is despite the fact that Prahalada was not only the king but also the father of one of the parties to the dispute. Therefore, Sudanman tells Prahlada, if you answer falsely or does not answer my question at all, thy head will then be split into 100 pieces by the wielder of the thunderbolt. This is what Sudanman says. Frightened by this, Prahlada goes to sage Kashyapa and consults him. Kashyapa gives a very interesting reply that contains the core principles of the law of evidence. Kashyapa says, he that knoweth but answereth not a question from temptation, anger, or fear, casteth upon himself 1,000 nooses of Varuna. The person who, cited as a witness with respect to any matter of ocular or auricular knowledge, speaketh carelessly, casteth 1,000 nooses of Varuna upon his own person. On completion of 1 full year, one such noose gets loosened. Therefore, he that knoweth should speak the truth without concealment. In an assembly where truly a censurable act is not rebuked, half the demerit of that act attacheth the head of the assembly, a fourth to the person acting censurably, and a fourth unto those others that are there. In that assembly, on the other hand, when he that deserveth censure is rebuked, the head of the assembly becometh freed from all sins, and the other members also incur none. It is only the perpetrator himself of the act that becomes responsible for it. A person becomes a witness in consequence of his having seen, heard, and understood the thing. This is what Vidura says. Therefore, a witness should always tell the truth. This is what Kashyapa says. This statement of Kashyapa refers to eyewitness account, ocular, and hearsay, auricular, both of which find a place in the Indian Evidence Act. Hearing these words of Kashyapa, Prahlada pronounces a judgment against his own son, Virochana. This story narrated by Vidura at the time of Draupadi Vastraharana indicates that a judge should be impartial. He should not shirk his responsibility to judge a case according to his own understanding and ability, and that a person, when questioned by a depressed soul, is obliged to speak the truth. Dear friends, before I conclude, I will say only one more thing. Persons who practice law are generally addressed by the members of their own fraternity as learned persons. Mahabharata contains an episode that highlights the importance of professionals maintaining highest standards of ethical conduct. Though this episode is not found in the Sanskrit version, it is found in the versions of the epic in some other languages such as Tamil. Just before the commencement of the war, Duryodhana is advised to offer a human sacrifice at the most appropriate time so that he could win the war. Unfortunately for him, the person who had no equals in the science of astrology was Sahadeva, and he was not merely in the opposite camp but was himself an opponent. However, Duryodhana goes to Sahadeva and consults him, and Sahadeva fixes the most auspicious and appropriate time for Duryodhana to perform the human sacrifice so that the Kauravas could win the war against Pandavas. Sahadeva's logic was that a learned man can never deny the benefit of his learning to a person who approaches him, even if he be his enemy. Sahadeva thus exhibits the highest degree of professional ethics. But fortunately for the Pandavas, Lord Krishna saves the day for them by playing a trick. Dear friends, what I have ventured to cover in this speech is not even the tip of the iceberg. Both the epics are huge oceans of milk from which I could just take a few droplets. It will be good if these few droplets will induce you to dive deep into this ocean. With these few words, I thank Atmalaya for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much. I have finished.
Within a short time, we had an audio-visual conducted tour, Your Lordship, of our gigantic epics. You took us on a comparative analysis of the laws of Bharatavarsha in those yugas and now. All said and done, the bottom line is intact, and that is goodness and ethics are in the universal realm, unchanging and eternal. Every right comes with a duty at every level, the home, society, nation, and the world. Man's conscience knows what is essentially good and becomes the ultimate sakshi in the scales of justice. As we sign off, we all offer pranams to Saint Valmiki and Saint Vyasa and today's Kathakar Nyayadhish this evening on the eve of Guru Purnima. I request all of you to give Sir a big hand of applause. And we have a few questions that have been typed out. Are you able to read it, sir, or should I narrate?
I'm not able to read the questions.
Okay. Can I request all the participants to make your questions brief, because some of them have run into a few paragraphs and we are not able to identify what actually is the query. So one question has come here, which is very clear, and it says, what was the reason, Your Lordship, for
Yes.
Vidura to classify those 7 classes as incompetent witnesses? Were they actually incompetent?
Incompetence has to be understood in a particular sense. You see, unfortunately, the statements made by Vidura are like theorems. They require exposition. Let us say, for example, a palmist is a person who, according to Vidura, is disqualified. This is because Vidura doesn't want a person who can predict something to go to the witness box. An enemy is a disqualified person because Vidura doesn't want a person who is inimical to somebody to speak something out of his animosity. He also disqualifies a friend because he will have a bias in favor of the person in whose favor he testifies. So Vidura must have had, though it is not explained in the Mahabharata, Vidura must have had his own reasons for each one of them, like what I have said, for treating them as interested witnesses. For instance, we have a category of witnesses called interested witnesses. Of course, our law of evidence does not disqualify the testimony of, does not allow courts to disregard in total the testimonies of interested witnesses. But the judges are obliged to look at them with care and caution. This is what Vidura indicates. That's my understanding.
Okay. I hope we can go to the next question now. And that is, Your Lordship, could you please explain the relevance of ancient Hindu law in today's pandemic times? It has come out of a bit of anxiety. So, can you please address this?
See, though it is not stated in these two epics, the whole universe, according to our Sanatana Dharma, the wheel of this universe is well oiled by the karma of all of us put together. I'm in some other voice. I'm hearing some other voice. What happens is all of us reap the consequences of our individual karma. Just as we reap the consequences of our individual karma, the society also reaps the consequences of the collective karma. As a society, what we do, that creates a cosmic or societal karma, which also comes back to us. If we have to explain it scientifically, I can say it like this. Suppose we destroy the ecology, then the consequence of such destruction comes back to us in the form of earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, etc. In the Tamil version of the Ramayana, authored by Kamban, there is one interesting statement. When Rama lands up on the seashore and explores the possibility of crossing the ocean to reach Lanka, Vibhishana advises him to do penance, to do prayers to Lord Varuna. Rama does that, but Varuna does not come. So Rama takes the Brahmastram and Varuna comes and surrenders. After he surrenders, Rama tells Varuna, Samudra Raja, that my arrow cannot be withdrawn. It has to have some prey, some target. Please tell me whom I shall aim at. Then Varuna makes a very interesting, gives a very interesting reply. He says, O Rama, there are a group of men in a particular island located in this ocean. This group of men have been consuming so much that the natural resources of the entire island will get exhausted in no time. Consumerism is one of the greatest evils. Therefore, you please aim your arrow to that particular group, they can be destroyed. The need for preservation of biodiversity and the consequences that befall upon us if we fail to do so are what are highlighted by Samudra Raja in this statement. So this pandemic is the natural consequence of the karma that all of us have collectively carried out for a few years. That's how I look at it. And there are seeds of this thought found in, at least in this Tamil version of the Ramayana.
Can we move on to the next question? Your Lordship, was the procedural law more improved during Mahabharatam era or in Ramayana?
See, what happened was, there is I didn't have the time to say, Yagyavalkya makes a very interesting declaration. He says, in ancient times, there was no necessity for any legislation at all, as men were of very high character and morality. So as yugas passed by, men became afflicted with caprice, lust, anger, etc. In Krita Yuga, there was no necessity for any law as men were pure. In Treta Yuga, with the advent of Rama, there was some evil. In Dwapara Yuga, it is said that the cow of Dharma was standing only in two legs. In Kali Yuga, one leg. In the Kali Yuga, the cow of Dharma is standing only in one leg, and the Kali Purusha is attempting to break even that leg. When it is a process of degeneration. Therefore, the procedural as well as substantive law had to be more strong in Dwapara Yuga than it was in Treta Yuga, Rama's time. So I would say in Dwapara Yuga, the procedural law was more elaborate than what it was in Ramayana, in Treta Yuga, because of the need for it.
Thank you, Your Lordship. This question says that the gentleman has heard Mahatma Gandhi once
Yes.
said that the best government is
Yes.
the one who govern less. Has this statement any root in the epic of Bharata?
It has its root in the epic of Ramayana. How it has its root in the epic of Ramayana is this. When Dasharatha announced in the assembly his proposal to coronate Rama, people felt so happy that each individual is being coronated. It was not as if one individual was being coronated, but it was all the members of that society who felt that they were being coronated the next day. This is why, towards the end, when Rama Pattabhishekam happens, the tasks assigned to each one, such as Shatrughna, Bharata, Lakshmana, Sita, Hanuman, all that is mentioned in the Tamil version of the Ramayana, but there is no mention that it was Rama who sat there. And this is explained in a later verse by saying that all the citizens felt that the Pattabhishekam was for each one of them and not for Rama. In other words, people felt, citizens felt that they were the rulers and not Lord Rama when Lord Rama was coronated. Gandhiji summarized this principle by saying that when every citizen feels that he is the king, in a democracy, all of us are supposed to be kings. If all of us are kings, there will be less for a king to govern us and more for us to govern ourselves.
Your Lordship, the next question is, can a husband and a wife become witness for each other? Maybe they've picked up some instance from the epics.
No, in the, you can't pick up any, what happens is, even in the court where Draupadi asks this question, whether she had been won or not, Bhishma does not give a reply, but he says, Yudhishthira is the source of all knowledge of Dharma. Therefore, Yudhishthira can give a reply. Yudhishthira keeps quiet. All the brothers also keep quiet. It is not because Yudhishthira did not know the reply, but it is because that he did not want to be termed as an interested witness, probably. In modern world, there is a provision in the Evidence Act which permits a spouse to be a witness in the cause of the other spouse. But in the epic, there was no occasion. When there was only one occasion, namely the occasion relating to Draupadi's Vastraharana, her husbands keep quiet, despite Bhishma inducing Yudhishthira 2 times to give a reply.
Thank you, Your Lordship. Do we have time for a couple of more questions from?
Voice, voice. I have no problem.
Okay. So here there is one which is asking, there are various types of dharma. Do all of them find place in the modern era's laws?
See, the word dharma, as I told you at the beginning, has got a completely different connotation from that of law and justice. We have a variety of laws like Swadharma, there is variety of dharmas, Swadharma, see Paradharma. What I do according to my own conscience without affecting my relationship with others is my Swadharma. The modern day, our Dharma Shastras not only prescribe what you should do in your interaction with society, but it also lays down principles for principles of code to be followed by you even when you are alone in private. In fact, the highest ethical standard prescribed by our Shastras is that if you do not do something which you will be ashamed of doing in the presence of another, then you are the noblest of men. It means all of us actually wear a mask. We behave differently in front of others, and internally we are completely different. Our Shastra, Dharma Shastras take care of your internal character as well as your external interactions with society. But modern day laws can only take care of your behavior with your interaction with others, not with your internal character. Englishmen very easily distinguished this by differentiating between conduct and character. Our modern day laws discipline your conduct. Our Dharma Shastras disciplined our character.
Thank you so much, Your Lordship. Very apt reply. I think there's one question here now. The purity of Sita was questioned by
Yes.
Lord Rama due to an adverse remark by a washerwoman. This is one of the age old questions. She was hence banished. In the present era, can a judge do the same?
See, there are two things. One is this particular incident is referable to the Uttarakanda, the seventh Kanda of the Ramayana. There are scholars who hold a view that Uttarakanda does not form part of Valmiki Ramayana. Bhavabhuti has written Uttarakanda separately. Therefore, the authenticity, Valmiki's Ramayana is the Adikavya. I do not know whether the authenticity can really be testified, but let us proceed on the footing that such an incident had actually happened.
Okay.
Sita's conduct purity, Sita's purity was never suspected by Rama. There is no verse even in the Uttarakanda to the effect that Rama actually suspected Sita's character. But there is a theory in law which says justice should not only be done, but should also appear to have been done. A king has a duty not only to do justice, but also to convince the citizens that justice is being done. Rama was caught in a quandary. In fact, a very interesting question was put to a a person who used to give religious discourses. One fellow asked a person giving a religious discourse, "What, sir? Rama cried when he departed from the company of Sita. How is it that the very same Rama banished Sita to the forest? When Ravana took her away, he cried so loud. And when he himself sent her away, why did he not cry? Why did he send her away? Was the question put to the Purohit, the person who the person giving religious discourse. He gave a very interesting answer. He said, the Rama who wept because of the departure of, because of Ravana taking away Sita was Sita Rama. The Rama who banished Sita was Raja Rama. He had not merely the duty of a husband, but also the obligation of a king. King shall do no wrong, and the king should also convince his subjects that he did not do any wrong. In fact, I can give you a very episode, very interesting incident that happened in the life of one of the greatest national leaders of our country in the 20th century. I don't want to name that national leader. When that national leader was occupying a very high position, he was in the government. His granddaughter was reported to have failed in the 10th standard examination. Then when his secretary checked up, it was found that that girl had actually passed and there was a mistake. But before taking any corrective action, the secretary requested that person holding a very high office as to whether he could do this. Then that person said, no, don't do it. If it is any other girl, I would have certainly intervened and rectified this mistake. But if it is my granddaughter, I should not do it because people may think that I have done it because of the influence that I wield. Ultimately, the girl, the declaration of result that the girl had failed was sustained and the girl actually committed suicide. Now tell me whether what this person did was right or wrong. A person wielding power, a person holding an office of power has got a duty not only to do justice, but also to keep on convincing people that he is in the right course. This was the quandary in which Rama was caught.
Can I go to the next question?
Yes.
Could you please let us know the precedence that has to be followed while following the Chatur Dharma of Swadharma, Kula Dharma, Yoga and Sanatana Dharma?
See, unfortunately, all of them are there in the old books, but many of them are now not available. For instance, I began my lecture by quoting the sources of law as propounded by Manu. One of the sources of law as propounded by Manu, which I have quoted in the first part of my lecture, was the opinion of elders who are well versed in the scriptures, and Manu has added even one's own good conscience as the source of law. Therefore, whenever we undertake some puja or vrata or some austerity at home, the Purohit will say, Amma, please do whatever has been your custom, because there is Kulacharam, Desacharam, there are different practices. The precedents for which are set either by the elders in the family or by the people belonging to the same Gotra or by the people of the same village or found in the Dharma Shastras. This is how the hierarchy goes. We will have to consult them for finding out the precedents. In fact, I can tell you something interesting. Apastamba Sutra, which lays down the injunctions, Apastamba says one thing very interesting. He says, I have codified only a part of the Shastras for the benefit of the humankind. I could not cover the whole gamut. If you have any doubt, if you want to know something which is not written here, please go and consult the farmer out there in the field or the ladies at home who know by ancestral practices what are to be followed. This is what Apastamba says. That is how we take precedence.
I think we've come to one last question, Your Lordship, is
Yeah.
how much influence do our epics have on modern Indian laws? Most of the acts have been legislated by the British, and I don't know if this is absolutely true, but the statement is Indian Supreme Court judgments seem to refer to British and American judgments largely.
See, the problem is all the statutory enactments that we have are not based upon the rule of law that we had. They are not based upon Dharma Shastras. Society is progressing. We have our own the universal set of rules. Therefore, we are not following, except perhaps when it comes to the partition of a property of a Hindu undivided family, we follow certain smritis. Henry Main wrote a book on Hindu law, all that. But even that, with the advancement of society, with the amendments made to the Hindu Succession Act, all of them have now vanished. Therefore, I would say in lighter vein that neither our laws follow the Dharma Shastras nor the citizens follow the Dharma Shastras. If at all they follow at least the laws.
Yes.
You have actually muted your.
Yeah. Would our judicial system be better if our national language was Sanskritam instead of Hindi?
There will be a huge,
Would you like to take that, Your Lordship?
no, not that. I mean, there will be a huge uproar from some sections of our society.
It's a short and sweet answer. And I think I have taken most of our questions over here. I can't see any more. So, on behalf of Atmalaya, we give a heartfelt gratitude to Honorable Mr. Justice V. Subramanian. I also want to thank Sindhu Bhairavi Center, which is coordinated. I thank Chandana and Aparna, my disciples who have made this possible for us. And we have a distinguished set of people here who have attended the webinar, eminent judges, scholars, students, swamis, readers of the epics, well versed in their own way. We are extremely thankful that we had an August gathering, and there have been some suggestions in the chat, Your Lordship, that you should be invited again for national leadership points that can be culled out from our epics, which should be valuable for the youth community. So thank you very much. Namaskaram and happy Guru Purnami. The meeting ends. Thank you.